I am going to tell you in the next 10 minutes everything you need to know about no recourse to public funds. Except, of course, I'm not, because that's not actually possible. So what I have decided to try and do this evening with the short time that we have is to just try and explain no recourse to public funds in a little bit more detail and explain why it comes about and what some of the pathways are to getting out of being no recourse to public funds into actually being able to access things that you need to access. And part of the reason I'm doing this is because often, if you come across someone with no recourse to public funds, you're going to need to refer them on somewhere. And if you can at least explain a little bit to someone about why this person is no recourse to public funds and what's going on with them, then it will make it an awful lot easier for you to actually get someone to help them. So that's part of why I thought it would be useful for you to have some background in this in particular. So, no recourse to public funds is used generally in two different ways, but we tend to use it quite a lot as a catch-all term, but really it means two different things. So one is actually a very strict legal definition of no recourse to public funds, and the other way we use it is a kind of catch-all phrase for anyone who can't access benefits or other public services for whatever reason. But these are actually two very different things. Because when we're talking about no recourse to public funds as a legal definition, what we're actually talking about is something which is actively imposed by the Home Office on people who have immigration status, who have permission to be here in a certain category, okay? So anyone who has this active condition upon their leave has permission to be here, there's no question about that. But they have been told that they can only be here as long as they don't access public funds. And public funds doesn't mean everything that you might think it means. So people say, okay, well, public funds, what's a public funds? Hospital and healthcare, that's obviously a public fund. No, hospital and healthcare is not a public fund. Legal aid is not a public fund. Education for children is not a public fund. So lots of things that come from the public purse are not necessarily public funds within this meaning of the word. When we're talking about public funds as a legal term, it's defined within the immigration rules, and what it actually means is non-contributory benefits and social housing, very broadly. That's what it's talking about. So if you have a condition of no recourse to public funds attached to your leave, you can't go down to the benefits office and claim what used to be job seekers allowance, income-based job seekers allowance, which is now probably universal credit in most places. But if you had been paying tax contributions over the last 2 years, you could get a contributions-based benefit potentially, even though your little piece of paper that you have from the Home Office says no recourse to public funds. So that's something which is worth knowing. So, what is not a public fund? So I've just mentioned contributions-based benefits. They are not a public fund. Access to medical care is not a public fund. And there are rules which define access to medical care, but they're actually an entire separate area of law, which doesn't, just because someone says no recourse to public funds on their leave, it doesn't mean they can't access medical care, so be aware of that. Education for school-aged children, social services assistance for those who might qualify, and legal aid. None of that is actually a public fund. So there are lots of things which you don't think that people can access, which they might actually be able to access, which is a useful thing to know. But by and large, the more common usage we see of no recourse to public funds is the non-legal definition, which just means that someone is having problems accessing benefits, usually because they don't actually have an immigration status. So someone hasn't got permission to be in the UK at this moment in time, and so because of that, they then can't access benefits, or they struggle to access healthcare or other kind of things that they might need on a day-to-day basis. And that's why lots of people with no recourse to public funds end up in night shelters, because they become destitute, because they can't access public funds, they can't access housing, and they end up on the streets. So what I thought I would do is kind of break down people who have no recourse into different categories. So I did this little diagram. So no recourse to public funds, NRPF as we call it. So The top category is someone who has permission to be here, but they have this condition of no recourse to public funds attached to their leave. So those are people who have status, but have a condition. Then the next people are people who just don't have immigration status. They don't have the right documents to be here at this particular point in time. Next, we have people who can't pass the habitual residence test, and this will be the situation with lots of European migrants in your winter night shelters. As a European, at present, they don't need permission to be here from the government, but they do need to be able to pass the habitual residence test to get benefits, and sometimes they struggle to do that. I'm not going to talk too much about Europeans in my presentation. I'm going to leave that to Jean. Lucky old Jean. And then at the bottom, we have people who do have status to be here, but can't evidence it. So if you saw last year a lot of stuff around Windrush in the newspapers, that was what happened to that group of people. They had permission to be here, they were legally allowed to be here, but they didn't have the right bits of paper to show that they were legally allowed to be here. So they then experienced problems. So what do you do if you're in one of these categories? Well, depending on which category you fall into, the route into getting recourse to public funds is slightly different. So if you are a person who has limited leave to remain, which is the category of leave you get, but with this condition which says you cannot access public funds, you'll usually then have a little biometric card from the Home Office, a little plastic card, and on the back of it, it will say no public funds. Have people seen little biometric cards? Yeah, they look a bit like a photo driving licence. They're the same size, got your picture on. And the thing is, when people have limited leave to remain and it's subject to a no recourse to public funds condition, it's actually discretionary. The Home Office giveth, the Home Office can taketh away. Okay? So that's what you need to know about that. What you need to be able to do is find someone who can convince the Home Office to remove that condition from someone's leave. That application is considered to be an immigration application, so it has to be done by someone who is qualified to give immigration advice. But it's considered quite a low-level immigration application, what we call a level 1 application, which means people with quite a basic immigration qualification can do it. Sounds nice and simple. Say to the Home Office, take away this condition from my leave, please. It takes an awful lot of work to get a no recourse condition moved. I can see people nodding here, yes. You have to convince the Home Office that this person is destitute. If they ended up in your winter night shelter, well, that's a good way of showing that they are destitute, writing a letter from your winter night shelter and saying, this person is destitute. The Home Office will still want to see 6 months worth of bank statements from any bank account they hold, just to check they haven't actually got thousands of pounds in the bank, but are choosing, for reasons known only to themselves, to sleep on a church floor each night. So it's not an easy application, but again, if you were looking to try and get someone to help you with that, by helping that person gather evidence of destitution, you can increase the chances that someone else can then help them to make that application and get recourse to public funds. So that's good news. The next category is probably the most difficult to remedy, because it's people who don't have recourse to public funds because they have no status. They may have no status and have an immigration application ongoing at the Home Office, or they may have no status and no application in process. If they have an application and if they have no status and no application in process, the only thing that will help that person is getting immigration advice to see if they have a case to put in and putting in that case. Because until there's some movement on their immigration status, there isn't going to be an awful lot that anyone can do for them. Bearing in mind that lots of immigration applications link to how long someone has been here, again, one of the best things you can do in that situation is help people to gather evidence of how long they've been here, and that often helps people with an immigration application. If they do have an application in process of some kind, if they have an asylum application ongoing, then really to some degree they're a winner, because if they have an asylum application, then the government has an obligation to provide them with some support while that application is ongoing. Asylum support is called, snappily. So there is something that they can access while they have an asylum claim ongoing. Remarkably, if they have any other kind of application ongoing with the Home Office, there is no obligation on the Home Office to provide someone with any kind of support at all while that is happening, which seems surprising when you think the Home Office can sit on applications for 6 months upwards quite frequently, and people can be destitute while that's happening. But that's the way things are, unless they are someone who has children, and so social services will help them, or they have quite substantial care needs, then social services again can help them. But other than that, there isn't any statutory resource to help those people. And that's quite hard to get your head around sometimes. But the good point in that is at least these people have an ongoing application. So hopefully at the end of the day they will get a positive result and be able to move on. So the application is the key for them. Asylum support I just mentioned. So if you are an asylum seeker, then if you have an ongoing asylum application and you are destitute, you are entitled to asylum support. Again, that makes it sound a lot easier than it is. Again, the Home Office don't believe that people are destitute unless they provide lots and lots of evidence showing that they're destitute, and letters from lots of friends saying, yes, I might be their friend, but actually I can't have them sleeping on my sofa forever and I want them out by the end of the month. So unless people can gather that kind of evidence, the Home Office are unlikely to accept that they will be destitute. And another problem with asylum support is people will be housed outside of London and the South East on a no-choice basis. So people have to be realistic and understand that if they're going to accept asylum support. Europeans and the habitual residence test, I'm not going to go into it except to say that if you are a European and you cannot pass the habitual residence test, then you probably need expert benefits advice rather than expert immigration advice. However, you may also seek advice on the EU settlement scheme, because the EU settlement scheme, as Jean will explain, is giving some people a route out of being no recourse, which wasn't there previously, luckily. If you are a person who has status but is having problems evidencing it, there are a couple of different things that you might do. One is that you can apply for a biometric residence permit, because sometimes you have an old letter from the Home Office which says, I have indefinite leave to remain, which is what they used to give out. But no one these days wants to see the old letter, they want to see the nice smart little plastic card. And you can apply for a nice smart little plastic card. There is an application fee for most people, but it is possible to get it. If your letter from the Home Office is quite old, so you got your indefinite leave in 2006, the Home Office will also want to see evidence that you've continued to live here since 2006. So again, helping people to evidence continued residence in the UK is quite important for that. And then the other handy get out of jail free card is the Windrush unit. Because following the Windrush problems a year ago, the Home Office set up a special Windrush unit so that anyone who was settled in the UK prior to 1989 can apply to the Windrush unit for free to get evidence that they have a right to be here. The Windrush unit is supposed to be the slightly friendlier face of the Home Office and help people a little more to evidence that they have been here. But again, it's usually helpful to try and help people to get some evidence together of their time here. The one thing I do want to say is that we have a hostile environment. We have a policy of making people destitute so that they will go away again. That is what the government aims to do with people who have no status. And you will have many people who will try to access your shelter, who may access your shelter, for whom there is no route out of destitution. They will never have recourse to public funds. They will not have a good immigration application which they can make. And I think you just have to recognise in that situation that while you might be able to get some limited support, maybe a one-off grant or access to soup kitchens and that kind of thing, no one's going to be able to support them indefinitely. But in that situation, what you are doing in getting them off the street during the winter months is hugely valuable, and it will mean a lot to them, even if it isn't a permanent solution to their problem. So how do you help generally if someone has no recourse to public funds? Never give immigration advice unless you're qualified to do so. It is a criminal offence and you may end up in prison. And I have met someone in prison who was in prison for giving immigration advice when he shouldn't. Help gather evidence if there does seem to be an application they can make. That would be evidence of how long they've been here, evidence of their finances. Subject access requests are lovely things that you can send off to GPs, to the Home Office, to hospitals, to local authorities to get their records that they have held on people to evidence that people have been here for some time. Make sure that they access what they can. Anyone can access GP services, potentially. If they're entitled to legal aid for an immigration application or a housing application, then that's not a public fund. If they've been working, they may be entitled to contributory benefits, so try and think resourcefully about what they might be able to access. Some people can get exceptional case funding to help them to make a case, which is a kind of special cases legal aid, and you can help someone to apply for exceptional case funding, but it's quite a specialist area, so you might want to find out more about that. And the other thing you need to do is build up directories of no recourse to public funds resources and legal advice in your area. Find out who's there, what they can offer, and how to refer people to services. If you have funding in your shelter, and I realise that's a remote possibility since most of you are running on a shoestring, and good faith and goodwill from all of you, but if you do, think about whether you can fund anything for people, immigration advice, no recourse resources, emergency grants to get passports, things like that. Have a think about it. I have put in your pack a little sheet of where you might want to go for further information on particular aspects of access to services. And hopefully that will guide you to some useful resources. I could speak for hours on any of these topics, but I've probably already spoken for too long. So I hope I've given you a very brief insight into no recourse to public funds and how you might think a little more about the people you work with that. I'm always happy to answer questions at the end if you have any. Thank you.